Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet.
He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
It's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, you know, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
I was born and bred in a beautiful town just north of London called Luton, and I always feel like I have to apologise for that. And I think part of the reason is that Luton is one of those places that at first glance appears to have very few redeeming features. But I was there for a number of years, and let me tell you, when you scratch beneath the surface, it has none, actually. But it's my hometown. I love it dearly. I'm very fond of it. And it's just one of those places where you have to dig a little bit deeper to see the beauty. So here's a picture of the view from my house that we grew up in, of the shop opposite it. It might look a little bit run down, but actually, and actually those are concrete bollards that you use to stop ram raids. But you'll see if you look very closely that someone's actually taken the trouble to paint them green. It's the care and the beauty that's gone into those particular bollards. And actually, my parents had been missionaries in China, and they'd returned to England before I was born. So church and faith were part of my life from a really young age. But then I went to quite a rough high school, and it was actually known as the worst school in Luton, which is quite a difficult accolade to achieve, actually. And when I arrived at that school, quite quickly I realized I was one of only 2 people out of 800 who went to church at all or had any kind of faith. And I suddenly realized you didn't have to believe these things my parents had brought me up with. And at the same time, all my friends at the church who were about my age just stopped coming. So I was forced to work out for myself what I really believed about Jesus. There came a point where I had to make a decision on the evidence. Is all this stuff I've been brought up with real? Is it true? I couldn't just believe something that wasn't true. I couldn't just put my head in the sand and pretend it was true. I couldn't take some kind of blind jump of faith. I needed some evidence. And for me personally, evidence has always been very important. After Luton, I actually went on to read law at Oxford and studied and worked as a lawyer for 10 years. I worked as a barrister specializing in defending people accused of crimes. And over the course of that period, the 7 years I worked in that field, I represented hundreds, over 1,000 probably, people accused of crimes. And actually, it's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. But every day, for years, the question I would ask is, what is the evidence? What's the evidence about the events? How does the case stack up? And the question I asked every day for years was, what is the evidence? And when it comes to who is Jesus, I'm convinced by the evidence. But what evidence is there? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, answers the question, how and when. It doesn't answer the questions who and why. Suppose I invited you over to my house and we went into the kitchen and the kettle was boiling. And you said to me, well, Steve, why is the kettle boiling? Now, I could say, well, actually, the kettle's boiling because there's a heat source in the kettle and there's a transfer of thermal energy across the container wall into the fluid, causing an increase in the mean square velocity of the molecules proportionate to the temperature. And when that hits 100 degrees Celsius, it causes a collective phase transition by which the condensed liquid expands into a gaseous state. Could say that. That'd be right. That'd tell you sort of what's happening. But I could also say, oh, the kettle's boiling because I wanted to make you a cup of tea, because I'd love to have a chat and really get to know you. You see, the first answer tells you the how, but the second answer tells you the who and the why. And there are some things that only the maker can reveal, actually. Science is so important. It reveals how things happened, but it doesn't tell us who and why. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, because you can't prove that there is no God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to look at historical evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. For lawyers, historical evidence is highly important. That's what you put before a jury in every case. The jury weren't there when the events took place. They're not witnesses to the events. They have to take a step of faith based on historical evidence every time they bring in a verdict. And I myself could not be a Christian if it required me to take some kind of blind leap of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of taking just a step of faith based on good historical evidence about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. But sometimes people say, well, hang on a second. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? I don't even believe there's a God. And I understand that. It might seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest is that if I want to know you, I can work out a certain amount about you by watching you and looking at you and all those sorts of things. But ultimately, I can only really know you if you choose to reveal yourself to me. And it's the same with God. We can only really know God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is God's done that. And it's sort of in a way you might expect, or which makes sense. Because if God is going to reveal himself to us as human beings, what's the most logical way to do that? It's to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and in particular, the resurrection of Jesus that convinces me that this world has a creator. And that creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what's the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is we do know Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed. First of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about Jesus. The first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus says this: now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But more importantly, there's evidence inside the New Testament. And some people say, well, the New Testament was written a very long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is that we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially the way this works is the more manuscripts we have and the closer in time they are to the original, the more sure we can be about the original. So just a couple of examples. Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900. So there's a 1,300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. And no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, 1,000-year time gap, we have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. But when it comes to the New Testament, it is unique among ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and the closeness in time to the original. So the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 others. And that's why the classical scholar F.J. Hort, an expert in these things, says in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone among ancient prose writings. And again, no secular historian would dispute that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that he existed. But who is he? Well, we know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, of bereavement, of suffering, of being tortured, and even the experience of death. And many today would say, well, okay, he was a human being. But he was only a human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but he was no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, there are two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was anything more than a human being, a great religious teacher, that's the end of the argument. And it's right to say that Jesus didn't kind of walk around with a t-shirt on saying, I am God. But when you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. And that's the first part of the argument. And then the second part is, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So firstly, what did he say about himself? Well, the teaching of Jesus centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, in pointing people to God, pointed them to himself. He said, it's through me that you come into a relationship with God. And I don't know how you feel tonight. You might be feeling great. You might be finding things quite difficult. I've had some great times in my life. I've had times in my life where I've got a job I love, where I was earning lots and lots of money. I was going on great holidays. Everything was really exciting. I found it absolutely fascinating. And it's fun working as a barrister. It's fun representing people who have done, people who've been accused of fascinating things. And it's exciting. And what's great is you go to parties and people are interested in the interesting things that your clients do. So they find it fascinating that you're a criminal barrister. And so they're really interested in you. And that's fun, being at parties when people are super interested in you. And what's great was, if they knew a bit about my area, they knew a bit of the people that worked in it, the people I worked with were actually the best people doing what they did in the country. So they would say, oh, you work with them? They're brilliant. You must be brilliant. And I'd say, no, 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 no. But inside I was thinking, yes. And I loved what I was doing. And it was so much fun. But even with all those things, good things that I had in my life, what I found was I always wanted a bit more money, a bit more success, a bit more traveling around the world. It felt like whatever I put in, when I put these good things into my life, I just wanted more. It was like I had a spiritual hunger. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And then there's the stuff in my life I don't really like. The bad habits, the stuff I find very addictive. I don't know what that is for you. For me, it can be like comparing myself to people. Or Instagram. It's actually the same thing. And I love Instagram. It's great. It's so much fun. But sometimes it can actually get people down because you're kind of comparing your behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reel. And it can get quite addictive. And Jesus said, if the Son, talking about himself, if the Son sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And that's also my experience. That Jesus set me free from lots of stuff. Some stuff like a bad temper. I had such a bad temper and he set me free from it straight away. Other stuff, it's been a longer process. And then there's stuff like guilt, worry, anxiety, fear. I wonder if you've ever felt like I have when you're facing a crisis in your life, either at work or in a relationship, and you find yourself waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning, kind of looking around in the dark thinking, is it actually going to be okay? Am I going to get through this? And Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. You'll find peace. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen God. And we've all probably come across people who maybe haven't been blessed with a huge amount of humility or modesty. They seem to think that they're God's gift to the world. And if you ask them, what does God look like? They'd think they'd only have to look in the mirror. Maybe you've had a boss like that, or an ex. And Jesus, who didn't have a trace of arrogance in his nature, said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. So firstly, his teaching was centered on himself. But secondly, his indirect claims. Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. For example, Jesus said to people he'd never met before in his life, your sins are forgiven. And the lawyers said, wait a minute, to forgive those who sinned against others is something only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins, to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And then the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. And I don't have time to look at all of them, but let's just look at one. If someone says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only had time to show them one verse, show them this one. And the background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God was considered blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders and considered worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus says this in John 10, verse 30. I and the Father are one. And again, they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. And those who were around him, those who heard him and who opposed him, they said, you're claiming to be God. They were in no doubt about what he was claiming, and they said he deserved to die for it. So from his teaching, from his direct claims, and from his indirect claims, it seems that the evidence suggests quite strongly that Jesus did claim to be God. Now, obviously, that's a remarkable claim, and it needs to be tested. And it seems to me there are three possibilities. The first is that it wasn't true, and Jesus knew it wasn't true, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and an evil one at that. The second possibility is it wasn't true, but he didn't really realize it. He genuinely thought he was God, even though he wasn't. And we'd call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other possibility, the only other logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So was Jesus right in what he claimed? What evidence is there to support what he said? Well, the first thing to look at is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And then this, completely revolutionary. He was the first to say it. Love your enemies. And Jesus' teaching has really been the foundation of our entire civilization here in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. And then think about this. We've advanced in almost every field of science. Just think about the technological advancements of the last 10 years. Brain implants, nanotechnology, Tinder. But in 2,000 years, no one's ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you'd expect God to speak. And then the things he did, his life. He must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. People sometimes say, oh, Christianity's boring. It wouldn't have been boring hanging out with Jesus. I want you to imagine for a second that you're facing a serious moral dilemma. So you're at work, maybe you're facing an ethical crisis, and you've got one call. Who do you phone? Who's your go-to, wise, sensible, calm in a crisis friend? picture that person. And then I want you to imagine it's Friday, you've had a piece of fantastic news, and you want to go out, you want to hit the town, you really want to party. Who do you call? Now, in my mind, they're two very different people. I would never want to get them mixed up. It could get very messy. You'd phone for ethical advice, you'd end up in a karaoke bar in Shoreditch at 5 a.m. It wouldn't be good. But what I found fascinating about Jesus is not only does he have the greatest moral teaching the world has ever seen, but he went to a party, the wine ran out, so he says, you see those stone jars over there, fill them with 20 or 30 gallons of water and start pouring them out for the guests. And they did, and it was the best wine of the night. I mean, Jesus wasn't the one saying, let's turn in, it's been a long night, let's go home. He kept the party going. And not just his miracles, but his love for the loveless, his love for people whose society had written off, those who were excluded, and the way he sets people free and still sets people free today. And I suppose ultimately his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character. The character of Jesus has impressed millions of people who would not call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him the best said this guy is without sin. But as I'm sure you know, the real test of character is what we're like when we're under pressure. When you make a mistake at work and everyone is screaming at you. When the relationship in which you'd put all your hopes falls apart. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were even born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices over hundreds of years, 29 of them in a single day. And some might say, well, okay, Jesus read the Old Testament. Maybe he was a clever con man. He read it and he thought, I'll go and fulfill these prophecies. But it doesn't work, not only because of the sheer number of them, but only because there were many things he simply had no control over. I mean, there were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, about the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. I mean, imagine Jesus reading the Old Testament saying, oh, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. But he was born in Bethlehem, something he had absolutely no control over. And then, and by far the most important, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant to every single one of us here. Every one of us is going to die. I feel a little bit awkward bringing that up on a Wednesday night. But it's true, it's the ultimate statistic, isn't it? One of us in this room will die. And you might have noticed in the media when a famous person dies, even in tragic circumstances, we kind of report on their death very quickly, and then we move on to discussing other things like their life or other things, because it's almost like we can't sit with the harsh reality of death for more than a second. We don't like to talk about death. I even heard of a hospital where they've forbidden the use of the word death. They have a much more politically correct way of speaking about it. They talk about a negative patient care outcome. But the fact is, we die. And it kind of touches all of us because we can all, I'm sure we've all lost someone close to us. I will never forget going to the funeral of my really good friend Jamie, who died in very tragic circumstances, and seeing his coffin and seeing it being lowered into the ground. And it looks so final. It looks like the end. And it is the end. Unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that Jesus died and he was buried, and on the third day he was raised to life. And that means it's possible for every one of us to have eternal life. And that is an extraordinary claim. And it's the basis of hope at every funeral. But is it true? I mean, that's what matters. Just because it's great to believe doesn't mean it's true. So why do I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I hadn't actually realized how much evidence there was for the physical resurrection of Jesus. And there are 4 reasons why I believe he rose from the dead. First of all, no one has ever really explained how Jesus' body was empty from the tomb on Easter Day. Well, some say, well, maybe the authorities took the body. But that's not very likely, is it? Because if they had the body when everyone was running around going, he's risen from the dead, they could just go, no, he's not. Here he is. We got him. So that's not likely. Others said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body, and they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But the tomb was guarded, and it's also psychologically improbable. Here are a group of depressed, disillusioned group of people. Look at what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something they would have known if they'd taken the body was not true? And some say, well, maybe robbers stole the body. But that's the least likely of all. I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb because the tomb was not empty. Jesus' body was absent. But when the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, the only valuable thing for the robbers to take. They'd collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterfly emerges. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been folded up and put in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. And the second reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, he was present with people. He was seen by many people on different occasions. And sometimes people say, well, that's hallucination. And people do hallucinate. The kind of people who hallucinate are highly strung, imaginative people, those on drugs. But amongst Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, the ultimate skeptic. You had tough, gritty fishermen. You had Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even 2 people would have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions. On one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then the third reason is the immediate impact. And here are a group of people who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And something occurred that totally changed them. So that 3 days after his death, they were going around telling everyone, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon, without parallel really, in the history of the world, because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there's an explosion in 300 years right across the known world. And the fourth reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the sheer number of people's lives which have been transformed by Jesus. More people today than ever before. Tens of thousands of people each day are placing their trust in Jesus. Today there are 2,200,000 Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. We have Christian experience through the ages, countless millions and millions of people who have experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And it's people of every ethnicity, every continent, every socio-economic group, every intellectual background, from all walks of life. They unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. So when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, the fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say he was evil or deluded, it seems unbelievable and illogical. So I'm left with the only other option. When I look at the evidence, it gives the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity is God. But there's all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. And when I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge made its way from my head to my heart. And Jesus said, I've come so you might have life, and life in all its fullness. And I've had my ups and downs. I've been through difficulties. I've messed up more times than I care to remember. I am far from perfect. But I have experienced what Jesus promised. It really is true that God has revealed himself in Jesus. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. There is hope for this life. Right now, in an encounter with Jesus, we find life and life in all its fullness. And that's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe he is who he claimed to be.